My name's Mariah Garnett, and the title of my exhibition is Other and Father. Well, I guess the work's kind of about it's about me trying to connect with my father, who I'm getting to know, and also trying to connect with the city, and I'm an outsider to the city, so it's kind of about me positioning myself as a bit of an other or an outsider to the material that I'm trying to access, I guess. So the way I sort of came up with the title for this piece, I was walking in the cemetery in Belfast looking for my grandmother's grave, and I saw a headstone that I'm assuming originally said mother and father, but the M had been chipped off and it just said other and father. That phrase just kind of stuck with me over the next several months. My main medium is film and video, and I consider my pieces sort of experimental documentaries. So usually I'll approach a subject with an idea in mind about something I want to make. Like for instance, my film Picaresques, my idea for that was to make a very straightforward period piece narrative, kind of like Braveheart or something, based on this historical figure. But I think my working process with that film is a good example of the way I work always. So I'll start with this one idea or this one interest in a subject, and then it always sort of just like fractures and spirals out from the original interest, the original thing I'm interested in. And the films themselves always sort of become documents of, I wouldn't say it's like they're process oriented, but it is kind of like documents of my process of circling around a subject and getting maybe closer to it, maybe further away from it. And when I'm thinking about making documentaries, I don't necessarily approach them as like a straightforward, linear path towards finding out the truth about something, and more as a process of investigation that's always necessarily like rooted in my own subjectivity. So yeah, the work I make, it could be, I guess, categorized as experimental documentary, but I think the whole like idea of making a documentary is like inherently really flawed, because it's always tied to the person who's making it and their perspective and their ideas about something, no matter how, and you know, journalism and media in general, I feel like is definitely informed by the maker. So I'm always trying to like reaffirm that I'm the one who's making it and that it's not like an objective truth. The structure of the films themselves is often really like circular or cyclical and doesn't always present like a clear narrative. And that can also be, that also is sort of, that's also reflected in the way that I present the work. So not necessarily, sometimes it's just a single channel video, and sometimes it's like multiple screens, or I think the sort of most radical departure from the single channel video form that I've used is this installation called Encounters I May or May Not Have Had with Peter Berlin. And in that one I used two 16mm projectors, and they share one strip of film and project off of the surface of a disco ball. So the image is like fractured and the room becomes the projection screen. And that was like conceptually really rooted in what I was talking about in the single channel version of that project. So whenever I'm presenting a work not as a single channel film, it's always because there's something rooted in the concept and structure of the film that like allows it to take a different shape. So that's kind of what's going on in the Sunken Gallery right now. I'm currently working on what I'm imagining is going to turn into a longer single channel film about me getting to know my father, who's from Belfast originally, and who I met for the first time maybe 10 years ago. So in the early 70s, the BBC did a special on my dad, which they presented as being about mixed marriage, because my dad was Protestant and he was dating a Catholic girl. And when I showed him the footage for the first time, he was really surprised to see that it was framed about marriage, but it was called Romeo and Julia, and it was like this sort of overblown, romantic, you know, two people who were torn apart by political differences, which wasn't really the case, actually. It was a lot more complicated, as I think anybody from here can imagine. So that footage is sort of like the root of this project, and the way I've chosen to access Belfast and my dad, sort of like the entry point I have into like knowing things about my father and knowing things about the city. So what I did is I reenacted the original footage here in Belfast, and I played my father. And that gesture was kind of like an attempt to get to know him better and an attempt to understand maybe why he left or what it felt like to live here. The two-channel installation in the Sunken Gallery is, one side is the archival footage of my father, and then the other side is my reenactment of it. And then outside the Sunken Gallery, there's excerpts from my diary from when I spent a significant length of time with him as I embarked on this project. There's also a monitor outside the Sunken Gallery showing him watching the archival footage of himself for the first time, because he never watched it when it aired in 1971. So it's showing his responses to the original footage. Beyond being interested in my dad and the place he's from, I'm also interested in kind of the conceits of documentary just in general. And so this is presented as a documentary, but a lot of the facts that are stated in the film, in the original BBC film, are fictitious and like made up to suit their own narrative. So the monitor outside the gallery shows him responding to the fictional elements that the BBC put out there to serve their own purposes. So the reason I installed this project in the way that I did in the Sunken Gallery is, so there's the reenactment footage on one wall and then the original footage on the other wall. And what I'm hoping is that the viewer will have to turn their body actually to choose which one they want to watch at any given moment. So I'm kind of thinking about it as like a physical reflection of the way memory and history work. Like, you can't actually have both at the same time, but they kind of echo each other. Because memory is another thing that figures into this project pretty heavily, because I'm relying on my father's memory, but then also like historical research and then other people's memories. And there's always like slight little slippages when dealing with subject matter that's so far in the past. A big part of all of the elements of the show are kind of exploring different modes of representation, which I'm also doing. I'm trying to represent my relationship with my father and my relationship to Belfast. So yeah, I guess it's both a critique of this sort of like very traditional narrative, this very traditional narrative mode of representation, which sort of forces, I guess, lies to be told, you know, or forces some kind of like crafting and shaping of a narrative that doesn't allow for all of the offshoots and tangents. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my work, is like focus on all the offshoots and tangents and frame it as an investigation as opposed to like a discovery. Looking at Belfast as an outsider, I've found it to actually really sort of be sort of like the physical, geographical equivalent of like my way of working in a way, which has made it really difficult to like, it's actually made it more complicated for me to make work here, because I find it's just there's so many different elements and so many different parts of the city and so many different interpretations of the city's history. And you know, I went looking for my dad's old street and it was totally gone. And it's just constantly shifting here, it seems like, both like physically and in terms of ideas or political, I guess, historical narratives. So yeah, that's something I'm both struggling with but really excited about, because usually I'll focus on something that seems like relatively concrete and try to complicate it, and here it's just like so slippery, you know, to like find a concrete statement to make about Belfast, which is exciting to me as an artist, and also challenging, because it's more complicated than I could ever make it, you know.